Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Outlander, where last week, Jamie apparently died in a tragic boat accident, and Claire apparently had been caught spying and apparently had no choice but to marry Lord John. It's such a crazy time-travelling historical drama show. But anyway, episode 711, A Hundredweight of Stones, kicks off with Claire and John having their hastily arranged marriage, and he's all stoic seriousness and she's kind of just dead inside, and not that far off on the outside either by the looks of things. She can barely say the words until she ends up looking at William, Jamie's son, whose hair looks more ginger than usual, but then she's back to her depression bed. Ian, on the other hand, is kind of sad about Jamie's death, but luckily he's got Quaker Oats lass at his side, and they slowly push and pull at each other until eventually, after some tearful opening up about his dead kids and his secret wane with his ex-wife, and that's kind of enough for her to jump on the Ian train. Choo choo. Roger and Buck, on the other hand, they're having a bit of success as they manage to find the tinker who sells them a gemstone. He can't tell them too much about Roger's dad, but he manages to point them in the right direction. And wouldn't you know, they actually find an RAF coat. But the lads who have it get all sorts of arsehole at them for even asking, so they back off and make camp for the rest of the episode.
Meanwhile,
Bree, who's apparently still in this show, is kinda acting like her mum in season 1 by necking all the wine. And then who should appear but Rob Cameron? Turns out he isn't in the past at all, and that was all just a ruse, and a wild goose chase. But since Jemmy won't tell him where the gold's hidden, he now wants to kidnap Bree to come with him to the United States. Bree being Bree is like, hell no, but Rob is quicker and stronger. But he's also an idiot, and as soon as he turns his back, she clocks him cold with a saucepan. As you do. But the meat of this episode is Claire, John, and the spectre of dead Jamie haunting them. And Claire's not much better than last week, because she's basically all about diving back into the depths of an ether binge, and then she's literally about to unalive herself with her doctor knife, but then she opts to give herself some whiskey, taking it a bit laldy and screaming and roaring all over the place. And downstairs, Lord John's tearfully tearing into some port, and he decides he's had enough of the noise and goes upstairs and like, hey doll, if you want, I can give you something to scream about, hey hey. Well, not really, but he's actually more about crying, but sure enough, after enough booze and sobbing and cuddling, they end up doing a drunken shag, and both of them wake up feeling a little bit awkward, and leave room for Jesus, or maybe even the ghost of Jamie in the bed between them, and admit that actually they're both just thinking about him during the deed. Classy. And it must have helped a bit, because after that, Claire's pretty much back to normal, being a grumpy madam and checking on Henry, who says he actually wants to marry Mercy, which Claire thinks is fantastic, because, she's a progressively minded time traveller from the 1970s. And John's like, not a chance, because he actually lives in this time and has kind of opinions on how the aristocracy should act, and also knows a little bit about the miscegenation laws. So it all kind of blows up, and they grudgingly agree that, they'll have to disagree and just make things work in this marriage if they both want to stay alive and out of jail. And after that, John's all about having a party and gets her a dress, and she's like, no. And then at the party, she's not there, and John tells the guy who turned up and told her that she was a spy originally that she's not turning up, and then she does an entrance, and that guy's like, cool, she's here, let's dance. And then he tells her, actually, he's a spy for the Yanks, and he wants her to spy on Lord John because that would be good to have someone on the inside camp of the British, which, I don't know, sounds kind of like a lie, but anyway, she buys it, but she refuses to do it because she's loyal to John anyway. William, meanwhile, is kind of being a dick to a wee lassie who fancies him because, I don't know, it doesn't make much sense, but anyway, he was cross earlier that day that his dad got remarried. It's vague, but emotions are high. And the next day, or week, or something, they're chilling out planning more dinners and balls when who would burst in but Jamie, who is not dead. And sure enough, turns out it was all just a basic clerical error because he missed his boat, and wow, this is deeply unsatisfying. And Lord John says,
your son is due home shortly.
And Jamie says,
William?
Which is kind of unfortunate because who's standing right outside the door? William. And he's like, what? You're not my real dad?
Everybody betray me. I don't have a friend in the world.
And then the troops arrive to capture Jamie, for some reason. And he takes Lord John hostage, kind of, and walks away, and Claire's like, ha ha ha, who wrote this nonsense? And honestly, we're right there with you, hen. Flabbergasted. So what did I think? Well, despite the flabbers and the gasts, I'm going to say that actually I quite enjoyed this week's episode. At least, I enjoyed it kind of right up until the last 20 minutes at the end, where it all got a little bit messy and about Outlander. But it was mostly hanging together really well, it pushed the plot forward in various areas, keeps the momentum going, had some nice turns, had some good scenes, some good dialogue, and it had some decent plot developments. I mean, to start with, there was that fairly meagre but interesting part of the Buck and Roger story. I mean, that's interesting. And we've had barely enough of it to cover a quarter of an episode so far this half of the season, but it is by rights compelling. Even as we found out that Rob Cameron isn't in the past, which makes things even more confusing. It's just a good old-fashioned search quest and adventure, and that's fine. And I really liked the Bree and Rob fight, because, I was tutting when I saw that she didn't just like glass him with a wine glass or smack him with a wine bottle. But no, she turns round and backhands him with a saucepan. Fair enough. And on the other hand, while I'm still not wholly invested in the Rachel and wee Ian story, because to be honest, it's just not that interesting, John Bell and Izzy Meikle Small, which is a priceless name if you think about what it means, did a really good job emoting out a couple of complex scenes full of interesting familial revelations and emoting well what the characters' internal feelings are. And, you know, I was cool with it. I thought, fine, they earned that scene, they earned the smooching at the end. And, you know, frankly, it was far better than the longer scene in the previous episode when they were just kind of sitting about and talking about not very much. And it was also nice that Ian tried to say goodbye to Claire because it showed that he made the sensible assumption that with Jamie dead, she would probably go home to the future. And that scene was quite nice, and it also did a really good job for the audience because it answered the obvious question of, is Claire just going to go back to the future? And the answer is no. The reasoning may be a bit thin, but we've got it. Also, Claire and John's wedding, nicely grim, no problems with that scene, even if the old vicar did kind of remind me of the guy from The Princess Bride.
Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today.
I also quite like the fact that John and Claire are both ideologically completely miles apart. I mean, they're on opposite sides of a war, opposite sides of a time divide, they're from different classes, although Claire is a little bit posh and she is from the future, but, you know, she's not upper class nobility. And I appreciated that, you know, Claire is doing her usual bullheaded Claire bit. The show actually stops and says, no, this is really complicated. You know, you can't just undo miscegenation because you say so, Claire. And maybe Lord John, being a gay man in the 18th century, has a little bit of experience and understanding of the situation that she wouldn't appreciate because she's a woman from the future. Now, the show has always tried to straddle a fine line with Claire and that kind of bullish bossiness that she has. And a lot of the time that can work, especially if it's the main character in a book and you're getting all their internal monologues and thoughts. And a TV show has to be careful because otherwise it comes across as arsiness. And this is a problem they've had in the past. But I think it's fine. It comes across well. And sure enough, yeah, it's rubbish that Henry and Mercy can't marry. And it's horrible that John can't be with somebody he can love as a partner. But again, this is a show that's set in the 18th century. It's not in the 20th century. It's certainly not in the 21st century as we are now. And wishing the realities of today, or even Claire's time, isn't entirely realistic. And that way leads to shows getting silly. And sometimes Claire needs to be told that because she is a terrible time traveller, has been established over and over again. She's rubbish at actually staying within the lanes of her timeline. And it also reminds us that Claire is not infallible, and certainly at a time when she's grieving, she should not be infallible. And everyone around her isn't just a dick. You know, they're actually people who are constrained by the reality of their time and their situation and the place that they live in ways that sometimes she doesn't see, and sometimes the audience doesn't remember that and has to be reminded, because otherwise you just go around assuming that everyone in the past seems to be an arsehole. And sometimes it's worth explaining things. Something that the show occasionally does a little bit too much and occasionally a little bit too little. And this show suffered from a little bit of that, but it also had a little bit of the pacing problem that I've mentioned for the last few episodes or seasons. And this week, it was mostly just towards the end as Claire and John left and went to his house after, you know, everything else had sort of tied up. Because the problem is, the way this was all cut together, I have literally no idea how much time is supposed to have passed between this moment and this moment. Is it a few days? A few weeks? Is it the next date? I mean, it's so vague that I just don't know. In the whole episode, the only mention of any kind of timescale we get is when Henry says it's been several weeks since his surgery. It also doesn't help that the scene with Ian mourning and that pretty disconnected scene of Mercy and Henry, the show felt like it was dithering a little bit. It was almost like there wasn't actually a direction or any emphasis as to what the plot of the show is. And it's true, it was just kind of mired in a bit of grief and a bit of circling. Until the party scene where something actually happened, it felt like things were all over the place. And that party scene especially felt like a bit of a hark back to the season 2 days of being in Paris and Claire coming down the stairs in the red dress and everything. Because, you know, a little bit of nostalgic key jangling isn't always a bad thing. But that whole scene felt a bit strange because, again, what investment do we have in this? Some guy turns up and goes, oh, I'm actually a spy. It's like, is he lying? Is he telling the truth? Who knows? Claire seems to believe him instantly, which implies that the audience probably should believe him instantly as well. But equally, on top of that, I spent the entire episode waiting to see how John was going to handle literally the redcoats coming for Claire. Like, the cops should have been coming in the door any time. And of course, that doesn't happen. They just get married, and that magically removes, like, all of her criminal record, the same way as, like, taking away a 5-star rating in GTA does, so suddenly there's no cops after you. And apparently, she just isn't under arrest. People might be a bit suspicious, but because she's married to him, no, you just can't do anything now. Not that it's suspect massively. But I would have kind of liked to have seen that addressed, even just in dialogue, that wasn't John just saying, oh, there's still whispers, so please come to this ball and wear a dress. Of course, I will accept and happily admit that what I actually want from this show, and what the show Outlander wants to give the audience, in the form of a TV show, have kind of diverged over the years quite a lot. I mean, it feels like I would like some complex character and plot machinations and the show to have a direction and a really strong undercurrent carrying it. And the show, at the moment especially, seems to just have a mourning widow and her dead husband's unrequited wannabe gay lover getting drunk and falling into bed together, then having soulful conversations and then going to parties. And we all get that Jamie's important, and Jamie's a big deal. But come on, we all know that he's not dead. It was never going to be his actual death. It's farcical, for all the reasons I mentioned last week, and also just again this week. We know that he's in Season 8, and they would never have killed him off screen in such an offhand way. I mean, yeah, it's fine. It's just silly. And equally, do we really need all of John's sex history? I mean, it's fine, it's character flavour, but it felt like it came out of nowhere and it was all just being jammed in. And also all the talk of...
Comes out and comes for 2 nights. And then it comes again, and its coming is a blessing that I accept with gratitude.
Calm down, John. But then it also seemed a little bit daft that he would say that his one great act of nobility was that he didn't have sex with Jamie when he had the chance. I mean, okay, I get what he's saying. Obviously, he wanted Jamie to be willingly his partner, and if he wasn't, then he wouldn't have done that. But then, can we just remember that this is a guy who has saved Jamie and Claire's lives many times over, has taken 2 marriages of convenience to help other people, and has raised Jamie's illegitimate baby as his own son. So, no. Not shagging Jamie was not his noblest act. Be serious. And on the other side of things, much of this episode kind of felt like filler. I mean, I didn't expect Jamie to pop up at the end of this episode at all. I literally thought he'd be gone for a few episodes and it would maybe have its own little subplots going on. Or maybe an episode where Jamie heroically fought his way back to Claire through many travails and all kinds of difficult situations. But no, he just pops up, and I hate to say it, there's really no heroism in, oops, I missed my bus and had to catch a later one. There isn't. And also, I'm kind of sorry, I'm lost now as where it comes to who's allowed to do what and where at what stage. Because 2 episodes ago, Claire and Ian had free passes to come and go as they please in Philadelphia, literally signed by some big general, and everyone's like, oh, no. And at the end of last season, they left with the blessing of the Redcoats to go off to Scotland and presumably to come back again. So why is Jamie running from the troops? I mean, is he on the lam? I don't understand it. Doesn't he have his pass? What exactly is going on here? And I'm sure that the show is going to try and explain it. But I don't understand how Colonel James Fraser's wife and his Indian scout nephew, who fought on the wrong side, can both be 100% fine to go to Philadelphia on holiday and chum about with Lord John and William, and yet Jamie apparently can't? I mean, it didn't make any sense to me. And in this show, where everything is usually fixed with a misunderstanding or a marriage or a small conversation or a couple of pounds in the pocket of the right person. But instead, Jamie's like, oh, some troops. And he puts a gun to Lord John's head and takes him hostage. I mean, yeah, sure, it's all played for comedy and laughs because we all know that, it's just a ruse. But that's just making things worse, surely. I mean, I'm sure next week's going to explain a lot of this. But it's all a bit silly. Oh, also, just a silly daft thing, because I watched this on my laptop and the way it kind of looked when I was looking at it. But in this scene, I thought that fruit ball was floating along the table like, ooh, I'm a ghost fruit ball, woo. It made me laugh anyway, So where does that leave us and everyone in the story? So Ian's off doing something. William now knows that Jamie's his dad, but I'm sure he'll get over that pretty quickly, this being Outlander. Jamie's alive again, obviously. Claire's now married, but I presume since Jamie isn't dead, that's not going to count anymore legally or in the eyes of the church.
That would be an ecumenical matter.
Roger and Buck are sort of on the trail of a jacket, really no idea where that story's going. Bree has now the kidnapper in her clutches, assuming he isn't brain dead from getting hit over the head. I presume she'll be able to torture the location of Jamie out of him. But what strikes me is, suddenly, half the narrative lines in this story have kind of evaporated. I mean, sure, we're only 1 episode away from the halfway line of this part season. But now that Ian's off with Rachel, I mean, I don't know if they're actually involved in the plot going forward. He sounded like he was off doing his own thing. I mean, the sham marriage story is pretty much finished. Jamie's back and that'll be a new storyline. The kidnapping storyline is presumably going to wrap up soon, some way or other, or take a major change, as I'm sure Bree is going to find out something, and Roger and Buck, I can imagine that being like a good mid-season, like, revelation is whatever the hell's going on with Roger's dad. But yeah, I'm kind of at the point where I presume next week will wrap up a lot of things and hopefully set some new things into action to springboard the rest of the season. But it kind of feels like this half of the season was a lot of faff for not an awful lot. It feels like getting a lot of stuff out of the way and then also tossing in some really silly stuff that doesn't really matter. I mean, it's not terrible, but as a non-book reader, I just kind of wish there was more happening in this story. More happening with a narrative drive. I mean, you know, I've said that for 3 episodes, but the kidnapping should be the story of this season. But it's really not. It's relegated to, like, the C plot, because Jamie missing a boat and Claire having a drunken bonk with Lord John is apparently more important to the narrative. And again, I get that this show has an audience, and that audience is not necessarily me. So yeah, rather than repeating myself anymore, I think you've got the gist of everything I'm saying. So I'll just say that until next time, these have definitely been my grumpy opinions.
I do apologize.
For what?
Coming